afternoon, everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Elodie, and I work as the Director for International Relations at the Academy for Research and Higher Education. I'm very glad to welcome you today for the webinar on higher education landscape across the United Kingdom. So maybe before beginning, I just want to provide some context for this webinar. So as most of you know, because I see some of you being part of it, there is at the ARES the International Relations Committee working on topics related with the internationalization of higher education institutions. And every academic year, the committee chooses a target country. And for 2022, it's the United Kingdom. So the aim of the actions organized in the framework of the target country is basically, on one hand, to better understand the higher education and research landscapes of the chosen country, so for today of United Kingdom, and on the other hand, and in the end, to facilitate the collaboration with between the higher education institutions of both countries. So the webinar that we have now is the first activity organized in the framework of this target country activities, and it aims at providing a broad overview of the higher education landscape in the UK, with some focus points on Wales and on Scotland. So to do so, we have the chance to have today 3 speakers, and very that is a tough word. Practically, sorry. Our 3 speakers will make short presentations, and you can already ask your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And then you will have the time to, we'll pick your questions. You will have the time to get the answers to your questions after the presentation. So I suggest now to briefly introduce the speakers and give them the floor. So we'll start with Laura Brassington. She's policy manager for HEPI, so Higher Education Policy Institute in the UK, and she completed her PhD at the University of Cambridge. And while being at Cambridge, Laura taught across 4 departments and was involved in widening access programs. Also, as co-founder of STEM for Schools, Laura is committed to leading conversations about diversity in the history of science and education. So Laura will start presenting, I would say, the general features about higher education in the UK, and we'll then move to Gwen. So Gwen Williams, she's the Assistant Director for International at Universities Wales. She runs the Global Wales Programme, which is an international education partnership between Universities Wales, Welsh Government, British Councils Wales, and the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. And after Gwen, so Gwen will, provide a short presentation rather focused on Wales, as you can imagine. And finally, we'll have a third and last presentation by Candice. So Candice Aldrich is currently Senior Policy Officer on the international team at University Scotland. She's on secondment from the University of St Andrews, where she's the Regional Manager for South Asia, Middle East and Africa. And so Candice will focus on the higher education landscape and specificities of Scotland. So Laura, the floor is yours, and don't hesitate to ask your questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elodie. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here, and I'm so grateful for the invitation. I, just to note, do have a flu, and I've had it for past weeks, so I apologise if my voice is not too clear, but please do let me know if I can shout any louder. So I've been deputed to talk today a bit about the higher education landscape across the UK. So I'll talk about student, staff, fees and funding. Then I'll talk about my institution, the Higher Education Policy Institute, where I work as policy manager. And as we, love these acronyms, HEIs, HEPI, I thought, how can I summate the current policy challenges that are facing the UK higher education landscape? So I've called it ABC, Orga, the dreaded B word, which we are tired of talking about in the UK, Brexit and COVID-19. So The term HEIs, higher education institutions, it comes from the Further and Higher Education Act of 1992. So instead of using the term universities, I'm going to be using this term HEIs because it means it's slightly more inclusive than the term universities, and it means any of the following providers: a university, a higher education corporation, an institution eligible to receive funds from the Higher Education Funding Council for England, or HEFCE, aside from further education colleges. And in the UK, there are 165 HEIs, 132 of which are in England, 19 in Scotland, 9 in Wales, and 5 in Northern Ireland. Our oldest institution is the University of Oxford, which was founded in 1096, and not long after, just a meagre 200 years, or 100 and so years, the University of Cambridge, and there is my alma mater, King's College, Cambridge. Most HEIs in the UK are public, with a few notable exceptions, including the University of Buckingham. Higher education is a hugely important part of the UK national economy. Universities in England alone contribute around £95 billion to the UK economy and support 115,000 jobs in England. On the note about funding, Universities UK, or UUK, is an advocacy organisation for universities in the UK, as you might imagine. And so I'm just kind of throwing a few stats here on the slide to you. And while you read over those, I'll just give a sort of potted biography of the introduction of fees and funding to the UK higher education landscape. So 1980 was the year in which the UK introduced overseas student fees. 2003 was another kind of milestone with the introduction of top-up fees, prior to which all universities, apart from Buckingham, charged £1,050 a year for undergraduates. And then in 2010 was the introduction of the highly controversial £9,000 a year tuition fees. And now that stands at £9,250, and the concept of maintenance grants has been abolished. So this is funded kind of by a student loan system. So typically 18-year-old student will take out a student loan to fund their studies, and the extent of that loan that gets repaid and the rate of repayment is determined by that student's income after graduation, and the debt, it currently is written off after 30 years, but that threshold is going to be raised to 40 years, which I'll come on to in a minute. So there's no HEI without staff. In 2019-20, there were 409,055 staff at UUK member institutions. And those with a non-UK nationality made up half, so 48.9% of academic staff, and more than 1/5 of all staff combined. It varies by subject though, so as you might imagine, so non-UK staff accounted for nearly half of academic staff in engineering and technology, compared to only 13.3% in education. And you might be interested to know that the subjects with the most staff with EU nationality were the biological, mathematical and physical sciences, where they accounted for 22.8% of staff. And then, of course, we have students. So in 2020-2021, there were 2,751,865 students in higher education, and this represented an increase of 9% on the previous year. And I'll come to the impact of COVID on those figures towards the end of the presentation. In England, degrees are structured as a 3-year bachelor programme, 1 to 2 year master's programme, and then the PhD is usually 3 to 4 years, maybe 3 years of funding. And it's important, of course, not to forget the part-time options. Students domiciled in the UK made up the largest proportion of enrolments, and these increased by 13% compared to the previous year. Non-UK domiciled student enrolments increased by 4%, and this was largely driven by an increase in non-EU students. Within the EU, more students from Italy enrolled at UK providers in 2020-2021 than any other EU country, and for providers in England specifically, Romania has replaced France for second position in student enrolment numbers from the EU. And this slide here, I hope you can see, it provides student numbers across England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And in 2018-19, there were 1.5 million in England, about 173,000 in Scotland, just over 100,000 in Wales, and 63,500 in Northern Ireland. And this slide here just basically shows that full-time undergraduates, full-time postgraduates, and postgraduates in general are on the rise, and the only kind of demographic to have decreased in the last 15 years are part-time undergraduates. Demand will most likely continue to increase because the UK is seeing a boom in the number of 18-year-olds. And HEPI has produced a report on precisely this topic. And this graph here just shows that having a university education remains the predominant aspiration for parents. A quick slide on sort of HE Policy 101 and the different kinds of networks that drive the production of policy. So the top left there is a picture of Michelle Donnellan, and she is the Minister for Higher and Further Education as of September 2021, and she previously held the office of Minister for Universities in 2020. Then, of course, there's Her Majesty's Treasury, the Department for Education, some intermediary bodies like funding councils and research councils like UKRI. There are representative bodies like UUK, the National Union of Students, or the NUS, and the Russell Group represents 24 HEIs. There are also mission groups like London Higher, representing, as you might imagine, universities or HEIs in London, and Million Plus. And then there are think tanks, so the Institute for Public Policy Research, or IPPR, Policy Exchange, and HEPI. So on to HEPI. HEPI is the UK's only specialist higher education think tank. We were founded in 2002. We're UK-wide, independent and non-partisan. Our independence is guarded by an advisory board and a board of trustees, and Professor Sally Mapston, the Vice-Chancellor of where I did my undergraduate degree, St Andrews, was appointed the chair of HEPI's trustees in late 2021. And we are funded by universities as well as corporate partners. We produce a whole range of reports on really wide and varied topics. So student experience, we publish an annual student academic experience survey. We have recently had input in a report on living Black at university. We've published on understanding the rise of China, decolonizing the curriculum, and national security. And I'd be happy to go into more depth on these reports in the Q&A. We also publish a daily blog, which has around 12,000 subscribers, including most UK Vice-Chancellors, MPs and other policymakers, and that's completely open access, and I would encourage you all to subscribe to our daily email. Now, I have raced through that because I'm trying to cover as much ground as possible, and I can come on now to the ABC, but I won't tease you. I will get straight to Brexit because I imagine that's what most people are interested in. So international students are worth £28.8 billion to the UK economy. And the map here outlines the impact of that contribution across the regions. Since Brexit, we are seeing a higher proportion of all students coming from the UK, and this is the first increase in the UK student population since the late 2000s. This drop-off in EU members is no doubt making our campuses much less diverse, particularly because those who do come are more likely to come from more well-off backgrounds, since students from the EU, EEA and Switzerland, starting in 2021 or later, are having to pay the overseas fees rate instead of the home student fees rate. So that's typically in the region of £23,000 to £25,000 a year. This graph here just shows international and EU students on full-time programmes, and HEPI again published a policy note precisely on this issue, which I'd be happy to talk about in more detail in the Q&A. And of course, the impact of Brexit is not only on student populations, but it's also on academics and the opportunities for research collaboration. So in the wake of Brexit, we saw a number of news articles on academics leaving the UK, and recent work on the HEPI blog. So here's one by a PhD student in Switzerland on Horizon Europe and how the UK still has not become a part of that, as well as the impact of the situation in Hong Kong on UK higher education. Kind of going in reverse order, so BCA rather than ABC, I'll now just have a look at COVID. So contrary to sort of popular belief, most predictions on COVID and its impact on higher education have been wrong. There are a record number of students set to take their next step this summer, reported one news article. And with that comes certain opportunities, but also certain costs. So while demand for higher education continues to increase, my colleague Alexis Brown, author of the National Security paper, also wrote a policy note on intellectual property. So some concerns coming out of the COVID landscape are who, for example, owns online lecture recordings. And this graphic here shows that face-to-face learning has leapt from being twice as popular to 3 times as popular among students. The third kind of key issue that I want to focus on is the kind of the latest big shakeup of higher education policy, and that is the Orga review, which you may or may never have heard of at all. So in February 2018, then Prime Minister Theresa May announced a review of post-18 education and funding in England, led by financial services expert Philip Orga. And the review was to look at issues such as choice, access, skills provision, value for money, how students would contribute to the cost of their studies, and this, of course, has wide-ranging implications for the higher education landscape across the UK. The report was published in May 2019, and some of the recommendations included reducing higher education tuition fees, extending the student loan repayment period, reducing the threshold for repayments, and reintroducing maintenance grants. After several years, the government's response to the Orga review was finally released in February 2022. And some of the outcomes are a 2-year freeze on tuition fees, the extension of the repayment period from 30 to 40 years, and a lowering of the repayment threshold to £25,000. The sector's response to Orga has been varied, as you might imagine. So again, HEPI published a wide range of voices on this issue, as we are non-partisan, and we like to listen to evidence-informed debate. So yeah, there are people landing on both sides of the spectrum. These are a few of the other kind of key issues facing the UK higher education landscape right now. These are including the skills bill and lifelong loans entitlement. Ongoing industrial action, so that this has been going on since 2018, and widening access with the foundation of a number of foundation year degrees, which are aimed to widen social mobility. And of course, the replacement of Erasmus Plus, the touring scheme, is meant to have play a brief part in this. But for now, I will hand on to, I believe, our presentation on Wales. So thank you very much for listening.
Hi everybody, and thank you again so much for the invitation to take part today. It really is a pleasure to be here talking to you. So it's my role today to give you a little bit of a flavour of the 9 higher education institutions that we have in Wales, as well as the devolution context, I suppose, which I know that Candice will also contribute to from a Scottish point of view. I'd also like to spend a bit of time talking about the internationalisation activities that we've got going on in Wales at the moment, and possible opportunities to collaborate through some programmes that are coming out of that. So firstly, Wales's universities. So we have 9 higher education institutions in Wales. You'll see 8 of them listed here in front of you. They are Bangor, Cardiff, Aberystwyth, the University of Wales, Trinity St David, Swansea University, Cardiff Metropolitan, the University of South Wales, and Wrexham Glyndŵr University. There is also the Open University in Wales, which is the 9th member institution of Universities Wales. All of these universities are extremely diverse, and despite being a fairly small sector, therefore, it really does cover all kind of aspects of the higher education sector across the UK. These universities began in very different ways. Some, I think the eldest was formed in 1872, that's Aberystwyth. Some founded to train, for the priesthood, others from sort of voluntary contributions from local people, and others then more sort of specialist institutions founded by the industrial leaders of the day. All are registered charities and not-for-profit. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the geography of the United Kingdom, but this is Wales here in front of you, and you'll see that they're all fairly geographically spread as well across the country. 4 of these universities are in the top 500 of the THE University World Rankings. Between them, there are around 134,000 students in terms of population, 22,000 of those international, and there are also around 27,000 students studying on TNE programs internationally run by these institutions. So just to give you an idea, further idea of that breakdown, 52% of our students come from Wales, 32% come from the rest of the UK, and I think Wales in particular is affected by the sort of cross-border flow of students, particularly from England into Wales, and that does affect several aspects of HE policy in Wales as well, as you can imagine. 4% come from the EU and 12% roughly from outside of the EU. So what are our strengths in Wales? Well, more than 3/4 of the research that's conducted across Welsh institutions was considered world leading or internationally excellent during the last REF exercise. 94% of our graduates are in employment or further training within 15 months of graduating. We consistently score very well against the UK average in terms of student experience in Wales. In 2020-2021, we scored above the UK average on learning and teaching, student experience, and overall student satisfaction. A particular strength also in the graduate startups area, where we account for more than 13% of the UK total, the highest rate per capita in the UK. So Welsh population is roughly 5% of the UK population, just to give you a little bit of a benchmark. We're also, and this is a real priority for the Welsh Government, we're also the first nation in the world to have all universities signed up to a civic mission framework. So that means that all universities in Wales have to take their responsibility to their local community and wider community very seriously, and have commitments to really forward those contributions in place. So civic mission is a real priority for our Minister for Education in Wales. And all Welsh universities also are accredited living wage employers as well. So devolution is a bit of a complex field, but I will do my best to give you a very quick overview of where this is at. So much of what Laura was presenting to you around kind of higher education fees and funding is actually devolved. So a lot of what she will have said related to fees and funding policy in England. In Wales, this is devolved. There are 3 individuals, photos of 3 individuals in front of you. The top one, Mark Drakeford, is our first minister in Wales. Became quite famous, I think, during the pandemic for his various TV appearances. The guy in the middle, that's Jeremy Miles, who is our Minister for Education and the Welsh language also. So he is responsible for higher education policy, well, all education policy, including further and higher education in Wales. And beneath that, we have Vaughan Gething, who is our economy minister and is responsible for research and innovation within that as well. So ourselves as Universities Wales, we're clearly set up to lobby on these areas within Wales. Now, it's not quite as clear cut, not anywhere near as clear cut as I've just made it out to be. So there's also the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. So this is a body that funds and regulates all of the Welsh universities. So it also distributes the grant part of the dual research funding system in the UK. I should say, you'll see that UK ARES is also listed there. So we have a dual funding system for research in the UK. The grant part is devolved, and HEFCO has responsibility for administering that. But the research, UK RI and the research councils are funded very much from Westminster, and the competitive funding side of things, therefore, is not devolved. So another competence, the Welsh Government is also quality, by the way. So the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales also has responsibility for ensuring the quality of the higher education provision in Wales. And yet it works to do that through the QAA, which is a UK level, body. So you'll see this is a slightly complex setup that we have, but very much that the kind of the driver for HE and research policy is very much devolved. So I think that gives you a little bit of an overview of that, and I'm very happy to take further questions on this at a later point. In terms of international, then, we have around 22,000 international students in Wales, as I think I've mentioned. They make an extremely valuable contribution to Wales, both in terms of, culturally, but also economically. So they contribute more than 600 million in export earnings to the Welsh economy. That's 11.8% of all service sector exports in Wales. We do have a target to increase that, of course, and that is to increase exports to 950 million by 2030, and that would involve raising the student numbers to 30,000. Now, as Laura was pointing out, there are certainly some challenges with regard to that, relating to that dreaded B word again. But we are seeing also considerable interest and appetite for studying in Wales still from both EU and also kind of non-EU countries. So what are we doing about this in Wales, and how are we looking to partner internationally? Well, this is a priority for the Welsh Government. It's again a competence of our Minister for Education and Welsh Language. And we've got really two flagship programmes that we run with a view to developing international partnerships. First is Global Wales. This is a programme that I manage. This has been in place since 2015. And it's really a strategic approach to initially it was international higher education, but now also it includes further education as well. It's a partnership between all of the universities and colleges in Wales, Welsh Government, the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales, which I've just been talking about, and the British Council in Wales as well. And it's really bringing together all of the actors involved in international education together with a view to delivering one single strategy to increase our profile, recruitment, and partnership opportunities for the benefits of students, institutions, and really importantly, Wales as a nation. And that's very much kind of behind the programme. We've recently just been awarded just over £10 million worth of funding to develop the programme to 2026. We operate on priority markets, and the European Union is very much a focus for us, certainly since our exit from the EU as well. So we're developing our Europe strategy at the moment. We're also very much supporting the Welsh Government's international strategy in this area as well, and looking to develop their own international initiatives as well, which they are also particularly focused on Europe on at the moment, which is why I'm very pleased to be here talking to you. So how do we do this in Global Wales? What do we do? Well, we engage in policy dialogue. Part of the benefit of being a small country is that you can, and I'm sure this will resonate with some of you as well, is that you can have, all of the leaders of the institutions around a table. Often they have quite significant interaction with their counterparts within, the Welsh Government and the Funding Council. And we can really all move quite swiftly and in an agile way in response to the priorities or requirements of our partner countries. So we operate what we call a system-to-system approach, where we can leverage in the support, the expertise of colleagues from across our partnership to really work with their counterparts in the countries that our partner countries effectively. So we've been doing this pretty significantly, for instance, in Vietnam for a very long time, where we've been working collectively with them on the development of their higher education system in Vietnam. And then out of that come significant partnership opportunities for our institutions in Wales to collaborate with, in this example, Vietnamese institutions, which we can then fund through, to a small extent at least, through the Global Wales programme. We also run scholarships. So we run the Global Wales Scholarship, which is a postgraduate scholarship scheme offering a tuition fee discount effectively of £10,000 for students from across the EU and our other priority countries. We support the sector in terms of their recruitment aims, and part of the way in which we do that is through running the Study in Wales brand. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of the Global Wales programme, and if anything that I've mentioned through that is of interest, then I'm really keen to talk to you about it, maybe after this meeting, so do feel free to get in touch with me if that's of interest. The other scheme, which really made the headlines this time last year, is our new TITHE programme in Wales. So TITHE is the Welsh word for a journey. And TITHE is effectively our Erasmus replacement scheme in Wales. So this is a £65 million commitment to international student and staff mobility by the Welsh Government. Importantly, it funds both inward and outward mobility. It's a reciprocal scheme. As I said, for students, staff and researchers across the education sector in Wales, and also has support for strategic partnerships. Now, split across a fairly small group of institutions, that is a fairly sizable commitment to mobility. And the first mobilities through this TITHE programme will take place next academic year. So calls have been open. for our institutions in Wales over the past few months. Welsh institutions, I should say, also benefit from having the Turing scheme as well. So we have a wealth of mobility opportunities to our disposal at the moment, which is really, really fantastic. I'm going to stop there for now. I've given you a really whistle-stop tour. I'm very aware of that, but happy to take any questions as part of the Q&A, or if any of you would like to contact me after this session, please do so. My email address is there in front of you now.
I'm very glad to be here, everyone. My name is Candace Aldrich, and I representing University of Scotland as the Senior Policy Officer for the international team. As Elodie mentioned, I'm actually on secondment, so I normally work for the University of St. Andrews in the admissions team as a regional manager. So I'm very glad to be able to bring the landscape for Scotland. As Gwen has discussed for Wales, with the devolved nature, there are some nuances or uniqueness for Scotland that I can talk about. There are 19 institutions, higher education institutions in Scotland, including the Open University Scotland, as Gwen mentioned. So there's the Open University plus 18 other institutions that we represent. We do have some of those older institutions. Laura mentioned the University of St. Andrews, again, where I work. That's our oldest institution. And then we also have 4 other ancient institutions as part of the UK's ancient institutions. Something that the Scottish higher education institutions pride themselves on is a breadth, what we call breadth and depth of study. In Scotland, undergraduate programs are 4 years. So there's an extra year at the beginning for students, for undergraduate students, to explore the subject areas that they want to study. And so it's a unique part for Scotland to have that extra year that gives students a little bit of flexibility. It can depend on the program and things that they want to study, but traditionally they have an extra year, and they can potentially change degree subjects from what they start with. It's kind of like the US model. The US model actually copied the Scottish model. So it's a little bit different in terms of the undergraduate, postgraduate taught, and postgraduate research looks very much the same in terms of duration as it does across other parts of the UK. But it's that breadth of learning, and then also the ability to be quite focused is something that Scotland prides itself on. We are well known for the quality of our education. We have a number of well-ranked institutions. And I was just going to share some of our additional data. For Scotland, the value of the international students is quite high. Every year, more than 50,000 international students come to Scotland from over 180 different countries. And that's continued to grow. It's grown by over 20% in the last 5 years. For the academic year 2015-2016, we had just over just under 51,000. And then 4 years later, in 2019, we had over 61,000. And those are students coming from China, the US, Nigeria, India, Malaysia, as well as Germany, Ireland, France, Italy, and Spain. So there's quite a broad mix. As has been mentioned, we are noticing a change in the demographics or the socioeconomic background of some of the students that are coming through since Brexit, and that is something that both the higher education institutions as well as the Scottish government is hoping to address. And for us, it's not just about those that come in, but it's also our ability to send out. And as Gwen's described, Scotland is also beginning to work on both an international education strategy and a Scottish government exchange scheme that would supplement as well as hope to sort of match what Scottish institutions were doing as part of Erasmus, but also supplement the Turing scheme. Again, that's something that's still very much in early days. So we'll see how that develops. And as part of University of Scotland, my team also helps to facilitate conversations for bilateral agreements between institutions. But we also work closely with the Scottish government in terms of keeping them in the loop about those kind of conversations and meetings. That's the student side. International staff, like myself included, are also highly valued on across the campuses in Scotland. There's been an increase in the last 3 to 4 years of the number of international staff coming through. The top 3 EU countries that sent staff in 2019 was Germany, Italy, and Spain, and then the rest came from the US, China, and India. So again, international presence, whether it's staff, including academics or students, is a high priority for our institutions as well as our government. Sorry, I'm trying to navigate between the slides. I wanted to give a little bit of insight into how some of the different bodies, who are the different actors in Scotland. Again, you've got University of Scotland that's representing all of the higher education institutions. And then on the Scottish government side, there's the Advanced Learning and Science Directorate. So there are dedicated members of the Scottish government who work directly with the higher education institutions and liaise with members of Parliament, the government, to help promote and advocate for what's important for the higher education institutions. We have, as part of that, is the Scottish Funding Council. So when the Scottish government grants funding, then the Scottish Funding Council is the one that's responsible for that. As many of you may know, in Scotland, the tuition fee for undergraduate students is fully subsidized. So the Scottish government is paying universities for those students. And so that's a large part of it. There's caps and restrictions on that. But that's just one unique part about Scotland. And then other bodies that are part of our landscape are Scottish Development International, which is the industry-focused branch that works on promoting both the export and the import strategy for the Scottish government. And they liaise with University of Scotland as well as higher education institutions to connect that research and industry relationship. You have Scottish Enterprise, which is another extension of that in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship. Colleges Scotland, which represent further education. And Laura kind of explained how in the UK we tease out the further education and the higher education. And so University of Scotland represents higher education, Colleges Scotland represents the further education institutions. And then we have the Scottish Qualifications Agency, who calculate the credits and the levels for education in Scotland. I think I was going to leave it there for now, and glad to go into depth on more details as we go through the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Candice, Laura, and Gwen, for the very interesting presentations. We have a few questions in the Q&A. Don't hesitate to ask still more questions. So maybe the first one was for Laura. So how do overseas student tuition fees affect students coming for short-term visits? 2 situations. First one, a single semester for an exchange program, like at the undergrad or master level. And second situation, a student coming for a short-term visit, for instance, 15-week laboratory placement without attending formal courses. Something similar what used to be possible with the Erasmus Plus program. Would these students be required to pay tuition fees?
That's a very good and very, very complex question. And I can't give you an overview of the situation across the UK. So I would refer you to which I'm sure you're already familiar with, the UK Council for International Student Affairs, UKISA, who publishes the most kind of up-to-date data on this, and also the REDDIN survey, REDDIN, which is a comprehensive survey of UK university tuition fees for home EU international students. I'd be very curious though to hear from Gwen and Candice about this, whether there is a standard kind of policy in Wales and Scotland for kind of single semester visits. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it is a very, very good question, a very complex one as well. And I don't want to give you one easy one easy answer either. I'm a bit nervous, to be honest, to give you the answer. I think in my mind, it varies depending on the partnership and the agreement that the student would be traveling or the researcher would be traveling on. I mean, certainly through the TIFE program, the idea is that it would facilitate reciprocal mobility, including for a semester or for you know, a laboratory placement or whatever. So there would be funding there through that program to cover those fees, and I don't think that the student would be expected to cover those, but this is very much in its early days. But that's very much my understanding of how this program would cover that. But it would be very much based on an agreement between, you know, an institution in Wales and an institution in the partner country. Candice, passing on to you, is that broadly your understanding of things as well?
I think it would be institutional at this point. Again, we're still very much in the early days of our education scheme exchange scheme. So I think if funding as well as program details would probably be at an institutional level at this point right now. That helps.
Thank you. It's a tough question for the first one. Another question regarding the participation in the European Universities initiative from the European Commission. So does the strategic partnerships the strategic partnerships are part of the STACE program also fund possible participation of Welsh higher education institution? Okay, so sorry, the question is so in other words, are there any possibilities of funding through the TACE program for taking part in the European initiative, European Alliances initiative, or is it just for maybe student mobility and?
There is funding available for strategic partnerships. So there are three effectively funding pathways through the new TIFE program. The first pathway is for direct kind of student staff mobility. The second is strategic partnership. You can see this is mirrored on Erasmus to some extent. And the first pathway has been released, the first call has been out. The second one on strategic partnership isn't out yet, and as far as I understand, is just being finalised. So I actually haven't seen that. I know that whether or not this would fund alliances has been something that has been discussed. I would certainly love it if the answer was yes, but I can't tell you that with certainty at the moment. What I do know is that this fund is being put together with flexibility in mind, and the aims of it are to enable institutions in Wales to maintain and grow their partnerships, particularly their European partnerships, in light of the tricky circumstances that we find ourselves in light of Brexit. So I think that certainly is in line with those objectives. But technically speaking, I don't know yet whether that will be eligible.
Thank you. Another question regarding the TAFE program and the Turing program and the former Erasmus Plus program. So how do the Welsh universities behave with their partners? So did they sign new agreements? How did they organize, and how did they manage with the different fundings?
I think we were all quite curious to see how that was going to play out. I think this is a really crude generalization, but I think broadly speaking, from conversations with colleagues in the sector, Turing, because it's not a reciprocal program, Turing has tended to be reserved or used for the funding of outward placements, mostly outside of Europe, whereas TIFE is predominantly, I think, not predominantly, but TIFE lends itself well to supporting the continuation of European partnerships because of the reciprocity element within it. And I think very, very crudely speaking, that's how the bids look or have gone in.
Just to add to that, if I can, the Complete University Guide published a kind of an info brief on the touring scheme, and said, you know, it will open up opportunities to other international destinations. It'll include short placements as well as placements of up to a year, but it'll only apply to students in the UK's educational system. It won't bring students to the UK because, as Gwen mentioned, it's not an exchange scheme, it's not reciprocal, and it won't fund staff training visits to other EU universities. So the impact of that really does remain to be seen.
Thank you.
I'm feeling actually like I should make an introduction as well between those of you who are interested, and I know there's been an awful lot of interest in the TIFE scheme internationally, which has just been brilliant. And a new colleague of mine, Susanna Galvin, who's just been brought in to run the TIFE programme. So I think if you're interested in a follow-up session specifically on TIFE, I'd be very, very happy to facilitate that introduction for you.
Thank you, Gwen. I also had a remark and kind of a question for Candice. So I've seen in the 3 presentations actually how important are international students for the economy of UK. I also heard Candice saying that there is a whole education strategy in place or is being set up. There is an importance for the institutions of having maintaining agreements or creating agreements. And I was wondering maybe the proportion of the importance between the international students coming for degree-seeking students, and the importance for institutions of maintaining exchange program and getting exchange students, the importance maybe between these 2 profiles of students.
They're asking what's the difference in the importance? Is it?
Yeah, maybe what is the priority for the Scottish institutions?
I speaking as someone who also works at an institution, I think I'm fair in saying one isn't more of a priority than another. You know, obviously someone who comes over for a full 4-year degree program will be paying international fees, but the value that those students, whether they're coming over for a semester, they're staying for all 4 years, or staying for a master's program, that value, one isn't more valuable. The contribution they make isn't more valuable than the other. So a study abroad student who would come over for a semester is going to be just as valued for the insight and the background that they bring to the classroom experience as an international student who comes over for a full degree program. So in that sense, one doesn't have a priority over the other. And which is why, on behalf of the universities, University of Scotland is working and advocating with the Scottish government to get an exchange scheme similar to TIFE that Gwen has talked about in Wales, so that we can better facilitate. Because as of right now, unless there's an institutional bilateral agreement with institutions overseas, under Turing, we can only send out. So we're not able to take in the same way that we were as part of Erasmus. And we're feeling that absence of the contribution those students were making, again, to that classroom experience. So in Scotland, I don't think one's prioritized over the other. We want both, because arguably that means every semester we get fresh blood in, you know, even if they only stay for a few months. So I think they're all valued.
Would you mind if I just sort of come in on that as well? Because I think, looking at the kind of purpose of this session and kind of, you know, an overview of the kind of landscape of the UK, if you like, I think it's always worth bearing in mind the very different political context in the kind of 3 nations that we're talking about here. I mean, you've got a Conservative government in London, you've got a Labour government in Cardiff, and you've got an SNP government in Edinburgh. And I think, you know, it's no secret at all that the Welsh government were absolutely raging mad when we left the Erasmus programme, and you know, campaigned, you know, strongly against Brexit as well. And I think, you know, the appearance of the TIFE programme isn't a coincidence in that regard. It's very much because it's a reaction to Brexit, and it's a reaction which says, no, you know, Wales wants to be an outward facing global nation, and we value diversity and a kind of a global outlook within that. And how are we going to do that? We're going to invest in international experiences for our young people, and that means outward, and it also means inward, and not just not for economic purposes, but for the purposes of, this all sounds very grand, but for the purposes of kind of building a nation that is kind of global and international in its outlook, which I think probably is felt that's pretty needed at the moment.
I think that's very, very well said on our view as well in Scotland.
Thank you very much. Maybe a last question. We got a last question here. So I understand reciprocity is key for being eligible to funding, right? If so, what would be your suggestions to us on how to be attractive to students from UK for exchanges in order to have candidates coming to Belgium and have the requested equilibrium? What would be your recommendations to be attractive?
That's a really good question. I think my recommendation first would be to build those relationships with Welsh universities, so that when you've got partnerships in place, they are well placed to profile your institution and to really kind of generate interest within their population. I mean, I know that incentivizing students from the UK to go abroad hasn't always been an easy task. But I think, with the financial support there, and also the support within institutions as well to really drive this now, there's no reason why we can't make a really good push towards really kind of profiling and promoting these opportunities. And I think if you're working closely with the institutions, and if you're partnering up with the institutions on this, then they're probably the ones who are best placed to kind of profile you amongst the sort of relevant communities or kind of interested parties within those institutions.
I'd like to jump in there and say, I think perhaps one of the main kind of layers of difficulty has been the perceived lack of accessibility. So I think it's really about communicating very clearly that these opportunities are still available, or could still be available. And exactly as Gwen said, it's about forging those kind of bilateral partnerships on a local level, university to university, I think, maybe at this point. I think one of the things that the drawing scheme is doing that is welcome is its focus on disadvantaged students particularly. So again, widening access and focusing again on really communicating very clearly, as shown in fact by Robert's question, how difficult it was for us to in our day job answer that question about international student fees. How much more difficult must it be for a 17-year-old, 18-year-old applying to university to access that kind of information? So I think it's really about accessibility and good communication and forging those kinds of local partnerships for sure.
Thank you. Candice, do you want to add any advice?
In what sense?
No, add any suggestion to make maybe Belgium more attractive, because we heard that Germany, Italy were attractive. Yeah. We didn't hear any French-speaking countries.
No, I certainly think there are. Again, I think it'll come down to bilateral relationships. I'm fairly certain St. Andrews has partnerships in Belgium. And again, that's something where University of Scotland can help find synergies across our members. If they don't already have existing partnerships, we can help you find that. And that's a support that we provide, so that we can we'll work with groups of institutions to help them connect with our institutions, so that we can find those collaboration opportunities, again, not just for student exchange, but staff exchange, research collaboration, and the whole range of opportunities.
And unfortunately, and that I think the availability of English speaking provision as well is a factor for us in the UK. I say that we're a bilingual country in Wales, and we very much are are pro kind of, you know, languages and language learning, and there's certainly a push within Wales for that. But I think at the moment, that does have an impact upon kind of accessibility for a large part of our student population. I would also say that anything kind of more widely around an offer that promotes kind of employability opportunities, kind of experiences outside of the classroom, are probably also something that you might want to kind of focus on and consider if you were kind of profiling your institution, just as we do really when we're trying to attract students from overseas.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe a very last question, because I see that we run out of time. Would you say that the tuition fee system has an impact on the international mobility of UK students, the outgoing mobility? Fear of failing, impact on the grades and employability, delaying their graduation? So
that's a very good question. I don't think that's the primary barrier by any means. It could be for some. I think the primary barriers are around language, as I've already said. Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think, Candace?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about accessing study abroad experiences and that sort of thing, my impression has been it's the other costs that goes with, in addition to the cost of the experience itself, and the living costs, and potential visa costs and those sorts of things. When you start looking at the larger process, and if you're talking about access and you're talking about students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, navigating the visa application process, exploring that they may be first generation students, so they don't have a personal support network on how to navigate just even applying to go abroad, and navigating different programs and what's possible. So I think it's some of the maybe softer hurdles for students, and we see the same thing for international students coming over to do degree programs into the UK. So that idea of international widening participation or international access is something that is just beginning to, I think, be talked about. It's something that I'm certainly working on at St. Andrews. So I think it's the softer bits, because those students are already struggling to do a degree program, especially if they're first generation and that sort of thing, because they're already doing something for the first time for anybody in their family just to go to university. So then to also study abroad is sometimes above and beyond, is the cherry on the cake or something like that. So they're glad to be at university. Go ahead, Laura.
I would definitely just echo what both of you said, and as I showed, the number of students is going up. It's going up. We're going to see this demographic boom in the number of 18-year-olds, and there seems to be no sign of the demand for higher education letting up at all. I've not actually correlated that demand with demand for international student experiences, but it's exactly as you say, Candace. It's not just about economic capital. It's not just about economic barriers, but it's about social capital. It's about cultural capital, and that's kind of exactly what I meant when I said it's really about making these opportunities accessible and communicating them really well, and getting to the most disadvantaged students. We've also talked a lot about the sort of stereotypical university degree, but let's also not forget about technical training and technical courses as well. And there's currently a focus on that in the UK government, and why should there not be placements and opportunities for the exchange of technical students on technical degrees as much as the more conventional academic university experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Universities UK have been doing quite a bit of work as well, because I think there is a long-standing perception in the UK, which is slowly changing, I've got to say, that mobility placements are for language students, for instance, whereas actually there's been a big push over the past few years to really try to kind of change that, and I think that has been successful to some extent. But I think there's a job to be done there, and I think part of the work that is happening, or certainly was happening until very recently at UK level, was about making sure that we were engaging with staff within institutions in the UK, to ensure that they were kind of able to promote, or kind of informed to be able to to pass those opportunities on to the students that they tutor or whatever, because I think getting that buy-in and incentivization from staff who may not instinctively think about that as an opportunity for their students initially, is also quite important.
Thank you very much. I see also, I think that it's time to close the webinar. So many thanks, Laura, Gwen, and Candice, for the very interesting presentations. We'll share your email addresses so that the participants can maybe address some more questions if they have some. So once again, thank you very much to all of you, and I wish you a good afternoon then. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.